Up to the time of compiling this report, his colleague, 21-year-old Winston Hall, was still on the run.
And so began the run of David Oliver, Peter Bradshaw, Winston Hall.
Winston Hall and Winston Hall.
Winston Hall.
Winston Hall. Winston Hall. Winston Hall.
The year is 1985. The Titanic's wreckage was discovered for the first time since its tragic sinking in 1912. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. The Prime Minister of Barbados, the Right Honorable Tom Adams, suddenly passed away. This was also the year that 3 young Barbadian men would be arrested for the murder of plantation manager Cyril Cisnet. Cisnet's lifeless body was found at his plantation house, Francia Plantation, in the parish of St. George on December the 15th, 1984, by his gardener. He was a white man and was well in his retirement at 75 years old. Before his retirement, he had an extensive business career and had served as the managing director of a number of leading manufacturing companies on the island. Dr. Fred Reeder pronounced Cisnet dead on the scene at 7:15 a.m. on December the 15th, 1984. Dr. Reeder would go on to state that he found Cisnet lying in a large pool of blood, face upwards, with a large wound below the right shoulder. In the book Winston Hall, Guilty or Innocent? A True Life Story, Georgina Adams shares the account of that fateful night. Cyril, who was to be in his bed, was downstairs in the kitchen playing with his dog. Coincidentally, this was the thief's route of entry, so he found himself face to face with Peter, who shot him, claiming that he had reached in his pocket, so he thought he had a gun. Winston Hall tried to revive Mr. Cisnet by splashing cold water on him, but to no avail. The men robbed the house and left. It was not long until they were caught, as the murder of a white person was and still is a rarity on the island. Barbados is predominantly a black Caribbean nation with people of African descent forming the majority of the population. Barbados in 1985 experienced significant unemployment rates, particularly among young people. The lack of job opportunities and limited economic growth contributed to social and economic disparities. The country faced significant external debt burdens, which strained the government's finances and limited its ability to invest in infrastructure, social programs, and economic development. Hall grew up a regular poor black boy from a village called Suriname in the eastern parish of St. Joseph, and like many others during this time, his education stopped after he graduated high school, and like many others during this time, he turned to petty crime. There was a history of racial inequalities in Barbados stemming from its colonial past. Bear in mind, a generation earlier, blacks in Barbados were not permitted to walk through white neighborhoods or even use the same public facilities. The white community not only had majority land ownership, but they were privy to wealth, services, and opportunities, while the majority of the black population were not. The murder of Cisnet sent shock waves throughout the nation. The 5'6" 19-year-old Winston Leroy Hall was arrested for the murder of Cyril Cisnet.
The other 3 people who recently also dominated the front page of the local newspapers appeared as the crowd was thinning. 23-year-old David Oliver, 19-year-old Peter Bradshaw, and Leroy Hall are together charged with more than 20 offenses ranging from murder to robbery and illegal possession of firearms.
Peter Bradshaw, Hall, and Oliver appeared in court on January the 28th, 1985 to answer 22 charges of murder, assault, and robbery. Hundreds of onlookers tried to get glimpses of the accused in the blazing heat of the morning sun. The trio were swiftly ushered to and from the courts, guarded by a wave of uniformed and plainclothes policemen. At their next court appearance on March the 18th, 1985, there was an addition to the accused list. Peter Bradshaw's brother, Errol Bradshaw, had been indicted for the murder of Cisnet as well. As the accused were paired off while being escorted into the prison van from the courthouse, guards left Winston Hall and Errol Bradshaw unattended and alone. The duo saw the opportunity and took it. They ran and made their shocking escape in broad daylight. Hall and Bradshaw had split up on making their daring escape. However, approximately 72 hours after absconding from the authorities, Bradshaw's mother turned him in, accompanied by an attorney. It had been months since the authorities had lost Winston Hall. Police news briefings after news briefings spoke of ramped up efforts by the Barbados police force in efforts to recapture the man of the hour. There were constant reports and sightings of Hall in his hometown parish of St. Joseph. Hall, however, seemed to be always one and sometimes 3 steps ahead of the embarrassed lawmen. On August 29, 1985, authorities received a tip that the evasive fugitive had been sighted staying at an abandoned house. Approximately 60 police officers created a dragnet around the abandoned house. "Hall, come out!" yelled officers before breaching the abandoned structure, but the dwelling was empty. There were signs someone had been there and left in a hurry. Winston Hall had miraculously escaped. Winston Hall's narrow escapes were becoming a common occurrence, with the police being made to look absolutely incompetent while boosting Hall's notoriety as a local Harry Houdini. The public's perception of Hall changed from that of concern and shock to that of awe and humor. The masses found it comical how he was able to evade the lawmen with such ease. Obviously, this perception was unwanted by the authorities and the white community of Barbados, who were very unsettled at the fact that one of their own had been murdered and one of the accused remained free. An example had to be made. Hall had to be caught. 7 months had passed and there was no trace of Winston Hall. The police had a hunch that the longer he was on the run, the more likely he was to reach out to familiar faces and or family members. The white community in Barbados by this time was petrified. All they were thinking was that Cisnet was murdered in cold blood and any one of them could be next, as no examples had been made of the perpetrators. Furthermore, one of the accused had escaped and was running wild, and the authorities could not find him. In a move of ultimate desperation, allegedly, 3 police officers took Hall's brother Desmond, against his will, to a sugarcane field during the night. The allegations state that they beat, violated, and threatened his life for him to reveal the location of his fugitive brother. The allegations continued that the 3 officers beat Desmond until they were satisfied that he didn't know his brother's whereabouts. However, Desmond made it home alive. His mother pressed charges against the officers who had unlawfully kidnapped and assaulted her son. All 3 officers were reprimanded and suspended. The Sarah Cisnet's murder trial started on October the 24th, 1985. Mr. Elliot Belgrave QC was the prosecutor. He said it was alleged that Hall was with Peter Bradshaw and Oliver when Cisnet lost his life, and that once captured, Hall would face all the charges he was initially accused of before his disappearance. Government pathologist Dr. Sri Ramlu gave testimony and said he discovered 2 bullet wounds on Cisnet's body, one 6 centimeters away from the side of the neck. The main witnesses for the prosecution were the deceased's wife Denise, who was wheelchair bound, and Richard Trotman the gardener, who had found Sir Cisnet's body. Guilty, they were sentenced to the gallows to be hung by the neck until death. After sentencing, police increased their focus and attention to capturing Winston Hall. They believed that he might try to leave the island, given that his co-accused had been condemned to the gallows. Unbeknownst to the Barbadian authorities, Hall had already made his way 87 miles across the Caribbean Sea to the nearby island of St. Vincent. Four years had passed and Winston Hall was still on the run. He had grown thick dreadlocks. He had been living in a Rastafarian fishing community called Kesatil in St. Vincent. Hall roamed to and fro and would eventually find himself in the Duvalier Mountains on the leeward side of the island. He always exuded a quiet and calm demeanor, and the only thing that drew attention to him was his Bajan accent. Hall settled in his new surroundings and had even made a couple of friends. One of those friends, after being caught illegally in Barbados and deported back to St. Vincent, told Hall that the Barbados authorities knew he was there and he needed to run once more. Kesatil had been constantly monitored and raided by the police for marijuana, which was a typical occurrence in the Rastafarian communities. Hall paid a fisherman to take him to a ship called Pacific Princess, which was Barbados bound. He was caught as a stowaway by the boat crew and when questioned gave the name Vincent Moore and passed himself off as a Vincentian man. The crew of Pacific Princess contacted the authorities and the Vincentian police immediately recognized him. After liaising with the Barbadian authorities, it was indeed confirmed that it was the wanted fugitive Winston Hall. Under police escort, Hall was returned to Barbados on November the 7th, 1989. He had managed to evade the Barbadian police for almost 4.5 years. On disembarking the plane, Hall was met by a swarm of police who escorted him swiftly away, while scores of journalists and onlookers jostled for position to get a glimpse of the now new infamous Bajan Houdini. As promised by the prosecutor, Elliot Belgrave QC, Hall was brought before the courts to face his initial charges plus absconding. He was found guilty of all crimes that he was charged with and was sentenced to death with his co-accused Peter Bradshaw and David Oliver. He was immediately sent to Her Majesty Glengarry Prison. In addition, Winston Hall was slapped with a second murder charge for the June the 15th, 1988 murder of Gerald Palmer at Clifton Plantation while he was still on the run. The charge of his second murder was mainly based on fingerprint evidence that only placed Hall at the house. This evidence was circumstantial, but due to his infamy and the justice system's scorn for him, it was enough for a conviction. This only seemed to make the public's adoration for Hall grow.
He's my hero.
Maybe he deserves to be free.
You can't stop him for again, yeah? Yeah, for Alcatraz.
Glenderry Prison was built in 1855 and from all accounts was a nightmare to be housed in. Here, Hall was allegedly targeted by both other inmates and guards on a regular basis. The prison was a virtual hell where there was heavy overcrowding of cells. Consistently high reports of sexual assaults and numerous vicious fights were not uncommon amongst inmates. Many cells did not have beds, and in some cases, reports indicate there were sometimes 7 people in a cell that was meant to house 2 people. The use of buckets as toilets was quite common as well. Along with these consistent issues, the senior administration of the prison were accused by prisoners of physical and psychological abuse. The ruling class was elated, and so were the authorities. They had caught Winston Hall, and he was where he deserved to be, in Her Majesty Glenderry Prison. The year is 1991. The internet went public. The World Wide Web became available for public use. The Gulf War began with US-led coalition forces that invaded Iraq. And on September the 5th, 1991, Winston Hall once again escaped.
It's the early hours of Thursday morning. The alarm sounds at Glenderry prisons. The unthinkable had occurred. A breakout from the place called a jail within a jail. Maximum security at Glenderry prisons. And so began the run of David Oliver, Peter Bradshaw, Winston Hall, all convicted of the 1984 shotgun murder of plantation owner Cyril Sisnett.
The whole country of Barbados was utterly astounded. If Hall was not a household name before, he certainly was now. During the inquiry that followed his latest escape, top officials at the prison stated on record that there were not enough guards employed to run a 25-man, 24-hour detail. Further to that, security monitors in the maximum security area were not working and was never reported, so they can be fixed. During the inquiry, it was also revealed by top officials that a prisoner had made complaints to a guard on multiple occasions about hearing what sounded like sawing in the cells, but this was never even reported, much less investigated. The notorious inmates eventually sawed the hinges off of their jail cell doors and forced themselves into open area. They took out the 2 guards assigned to the main area of the maximum security by overpowering them, knocking them unconscious, and tying them up in the bathroom. It was reported that Peter Bradshaw had stabbed the guard with a metal file during the melee. The forcefully freed felons were then able to climb up and over the walls to their liberation. However, once again, Peter Bradshaw and company were recaptured quickly, and once again, Winston Hall seemed to have simply vanished. Hall knew he couldn't stay in Barbados without being caught. The other Caribbean islands were more suitable to be on the run. Countries like St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Trinidad were in relatively close proximity to Barbados, and unlike Barbados, had mountainous terrains and large woodlands, which was ideal for someone on the run. Hall set his sights on the twin island republic of Trinidad and Tobago. On arriving in Tobago, he was befriended by a Bobo Shanti Rasta named Bibi, who invited Hall to live with him as a fellow Rastafarian away from home. Hall now went by the name of Tony Prophet. Bibi lived with his nephew Richard Madu and Madu's common-law wife Veronica Lawrence. Unlike St. Vincent, Hall was detested in the Trinidadian village of Sans Souci. He would get into regular fights with the villagers of Sans Souci and walked around everywhere with a machete that was sharpened on both sides. The Barbadian fugitive had seemed way more aggressive than he was known to be. Was it the incarceration at Glenderry, or was it that Trinidad was a much more aggressive place than St. Vincent? Whatever it was, the Barbadian fugitive had seemed very aggressive in the Twin Islands state. Hall tried to take over Bibi's marijuana operation, which led to numerous quarrels between the two. However, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was when Hall started to court and sleep with Bibi's nephew's common-law wife, Veronica. Bibi kicked him out of the house with Veronica in tow. Winston and Veronica then moved to the village of Guapo, which is closer to the southwestern coast of Trinidad. Hall and Lawrence spoke of wanting to start a family, and she expressed her desire to have 2 of her youngest children live with them. There was, however, one problem. The kids' father, Carl Dixon, had taken the kids away from Veronica. It was alleged that she had kept them home from school for months, hence Carl taking custody. Reports indicate that Lawrence and Hall confronted Dixon at his home and demanded the 10 and 13-year-old girls from him. Hall swore that if he didn't hand the girls over to Veronica, that he would chop up Dixon and burn his house down. Dixon refused to be bullied and subsequently ignored Hall's rants. The wanted Bajan fugitive continued to threaten and accost Dixon. A little over 6 months had passed since they had moved to Guapo, and once again the residents of the village despised him. There were reports of him stealing residents' clothes and food as well. The wanted Bajan fugitive continued to threaten and accost Dixon, but Carl had had enough and decided that he would make a report to the police. One night, Dixon came home to find his house ablaze and a fleeing Winston Hall in the distance. Hall had waited for the perfect moment and an empty house to fulfill a part of his promise to Dixon. Trinidadian police officers assigned to Guapo indicated that they were aware of a Tony Prophet causing issues and disturbances in the area, but arson and caused by a foreigner would not be dealt with lightly. Hall was now a wanted man by the Trinidadian police as well. He knew they would come for him where he and Veronica lived, so he booby-trapped their yard with barbed wire and headed to the nearby woodlands for days at a time in an attempt to keep an eye on the authorities, who were also trying to keep an eye on him. Maybe it was a lack of knowledge of the Guapo terrain, maybe it was underestimating the Trinidadian police, or maybe it was a disdain that the residents of Guapo had for him that made them assist the police in nabbing him. But unlike dealing with Barbadian police, his evasiveness only lasted 2 weeks before he was apprehended by the Trinidadian authorities. Reports indicate that it took 4 officers to subdue Hall, who was arrested while laying in bed with Veronica Lawrence. Hall rendered his fake name Tony Prophet to the Trinidadian police and was held for 39 days in Trinidad's Golden Grove prison. On interrogation, he was told that he would be tried in Trinidad and could be sentenced to life in a Trinidad prison. Hall immediately demanded an extradition, telling the interrogators of his uncle Grantley Hall from Suriname, St. Joseph in Barbados. With this information, the Barbadian High Commission was contacted. They deduced his identity and his fingerprints confirm it. On July the 18th, 1998, Winston Hall was returned to Barbados in handcuffs once more. Between the time of his escape and his arrest for arson, he had spent 2,349 days
Hall
as a free
arrived at the
man.
Grantley Adams International Airport at 8:15 last night, handcuffed and shackled, escorted by Inspector Mark Thompson of the Royal Barbados Police Force.
After Winston Hall returned to Her Majesty Prison Glenderry on July the 20th, 1998, the superintendent insisted there had been an upgrade in maximum security, and unless Hall had a pact with Houdini, Winston Hall would never escape again. Hall was back in maximum security in Her Majesty's Glenderry Prison. His behavior suggested that he was back to being the reserved and calm prisoner he had been initially. He seemed content with his fate. Winston had stopped eating meat and was exercising vigorously. He eventually switched to a completely vegetarian diet and had trimmed his weight down to 120 pounds. Stringent security measures were put in place for Winston Hall. Hall was not allowed out of his cell unless to shower as ordered by the superintendent of prisons. Even on his excursions, Hall was to be handcuffed. The bucket he would use to bathe with was to be security checked, and he was to have a 3-guard escort to and from the showers. On September the 23rd, 1999, approximately 14 months after being recaptured, Winston Hall made a sudden dash for freedom in the prison yard on his way for his routine shower.
Convicted murderer Winston Hall has scaled the walls of Glenderry once again. Deja vu, you may say, for scores of lawmen and so.
His seemingly spontaneous sprint took his escorts by complete shock. It all made sense now. Hall had planned this, hence the vegetarian diet, the vigorous cardio workouts, his return to being a calm and reserved inmate. They all were to play a role in Hall's latest escape. Hall's form was not professional, but his speed was unstoppable. His escorts had no chance in stopping him. Dressed in only his underwear, Hall sprinted at top speed to the ongoing cheers of his fellow prisoners. "Winston running! Winston running! Winston running!" Hall quickly scaled the tall gate, climbed onto the roof of the coral shed, down the gallows, and jumped over rows of cat wire, and finally made a 30-foot descent to freedom. A manhunt was launched, stretching from Licorice Village and Station Hill to the cane fields of Lear's Plantation. Hall had escaped for the 3rd time in a row. Once again, Winston Hall had humiliated the authorities, especially the superintendent of prisons at that time. Hall had become a living folk tale, and the masses loved him. They identified with him, and most importantly, they rooted for him. The news of his 3rd escape traveled through the grapevine faster than the speed of light. The commission of inquiry that followed once again demonstrated the complete incompetence of the prison authorities. Only 2 of the required 3 guards required to escort Hall were present. To make matters worse, Hall had not even been handcuffed as he walked to the showers. In retrospect, the 2 junior officers who had escorted Hall daily for the past 14 months would recount how stupid they felt as they had been lulled by his false amiableness. During the inquiry to Hall's escape, one absolutely shocking revelation was made. The armed sentry on duty did not know how to operate the shotgun he had been assigned. He would admit to never having received any training at all, and that the gun jammed when he had put a bullet in the breach. This was incompetence at the highest level. It had been approximately 4.5 years that Winston Hall had escaped the clutches of the incompetent prison authorities at Glenderry Prison for the second time. During this time, there were reports of sightings in Hall's hometown of St. Joseph, but generally it seemed that Hall had vanished. On May the 27th, 2004, a shop owner in the rural St. Joseph community heard a loud explosion outside of his property. He then heard a voice say, "Drop the cutlass," followed by another voice saying, "When I got to kill me first." That statement was followed by another 2 shots. Then the smoke cleared. Hunched in the fetal position was the legendary escape artist. He was lifeless and laying in a pool of blood in the middle of the street. Winston Hall was dead. His hair was dreadlocked once more and his beard tied into a knot. Hall was in possession of a cutlass, sharpened on both sides, similar to his Guapo Trinidad days. He carried a black haversack containing 10,000 Barbados dollars, which is the equivalent to 5,000 US dollars, amongst other stolen goods. On June the 3rd, 2004, Winston Hall was buried, with the ceremony taking place at Tucson's funeral home, where over scores and scores of people came to pay their last respects. Winston Hall is a folk hero in Barbados. The masses at the time of his initial arrest identified with Hall. They saw him as one of them. They identified with him. Barbadians felt as if he had been oppressed by the system, or identified with him as they too felt similarly oppressed. Despite him being at the scene of the crime as a lookout, they viewed his punishment as excessive. Although Cyril Sisnek's life was taken that fateful night, the masses believed that it was not Hall. In the end, Hall had changed from a timid, calm, and quiet teenager into a man who was willing to do anything to stay out of prison. The legacy of Winston Hall lives on in Barbados, and his folklore has been celebrated in literature, songs, and folk tales. If you have found our content interesting, please subscribe to the channel. We have more interesting content coming soon, so until next time.
You didn't try? Just our class to me, that's all. Don't believe it was a try.
Mama, just let go. Just let go. The foot went through one cap and just tear the feet of the cap. Like somebody had to see to believe it. And then he just let go and drop right over the wall.